Hi, my name is Brian Mizuki, and I'm a therapy extern at Hoffman Estates Health and Human Services. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about cystic fibrosis. This is of particular importance in May, given that in 2008, the Senate officially recognized this as National Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Month. I come from a family with a cousin who has a disorder, and having the chance to grow up with her, get to know a lot about her, and see how she certainly impacted our family for the better. I would like the opportunity to talk a little bit about her too and give some experience to the information I'm going to give. So to start, cystic fibrosis is actually the most common genetic disorder among Caucasians in the United States. It's a multi-system disorder that actually comes from the recessive gene from both parents, meaning that two different parents can be carriers and not express the disorder. So you could have two parents who have no idea that they might have the gene for cystic fibrosis and end up with a child that actually does have the disorder. What this speaks to is the importance of getting genetic testing prior to talking about having children, especially if you have the history of cystic fibrosis in the family, because this is something that can come as quite a shock and something you're not looking for. So that's something to think about as I go through the presentation. The disorder itself is actually a dysfunction of the exocrine gland, which leads to abnormal secretion in nearly all mucus-secreting organs in the body. And basically what that means is that there's an increase of mucus throughout the body, and particularly where this mucus becomes located is within the lungs. And that's kind of the primary function of what happens with the disorder is problems with the lungs. And some secondary reactions to that are actually things like pneumonia or things like bronchitis, which can happen as a function of that increase in mucus. So pulmonary function or lung function is going to be a big important factor in determining how an individual with cystic fibrosis is doing. You're always going to be very conscious of how the lungs are doing, especially looking for things like pneumonia or bronchitis down the road, because the lungs are always going to be impacted. And as I go on, you could see how as a child that might impact you very quickly. You might know things like that. You're running around all the time, and all of a sudden you realize you're out of breath. Your parents realize you're out of breath very quickly, and those are things to notice along the way. In 2000, as recently as 2000 actually, the life expectancy for males with cystic fibrosis is 31 years, and with females is 28 years. This is a tremendous increase from in 1960, when the average age of a person living with cystic fibrosis was 7.5 years old. You can see the big, obviously, disparity between those two ages, and a reason for some of the increases are support from families, recent services, and obviously advancements in technology and medicine that have quadrupled the lifespan easily. And as you could also think about having cystic fibrosis in the 1960s and the 1970s and even in the 1980s, your view of life might be a whole lot different than it might be in the 1990s and 2000s and 2010. So for instance, having a child that you don't anticipate is going to live through their adolescence, it's going to look a lot different rearing them as a child than it would today. So that's something I'm going to speak to a lot about too. But next I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the therapies that go into the actual physical therapies that go into the disorder and how you could treat it. So first, there's a lot of pills that you can take, such as oral pancreatic enzymes. There's vitamins, there's a lot of oral supplements, and there's a big high caloric diet that you want to use when you have cystic fibrosis. And in regards to the lung functioning that I was talking about previously, there's a lot of chest physiotherapies that go into individuals with cystic fibrosis. So in the past, and some of this treatment is still actually used today to some extent, but I remember growing up with my cousin and my aunt putting her over her knees, knocking her on the back, and what that function was to get mucus out of her lungs. And these actually go on for typically 2 times a day for an hour at a time. So I just remember sitting there watching my aunt just pound on my cousin's back for what seemed like forever. Shocking at the time, but you eventually understand what that's all about. As my cousin got older and as that therapies progressed, she actually wore a chest. And what that does, it vibrates and goes on for, like I said, about an hour, and that can bring mucus up through the lungs too. So the goal is always to expand the airways, to get as much mucus out of the lungs as you can. And I certainly saw a lot of that growing up, spent a lot of time playing cards with my cousin while she was sitting there with her vibrating chest on. So that's one of the big things that goes into cystic fibrosis therapies, and you can see how rigorous the treatments might be, and thus how important the family will play in implementing those treatments. They aren't like there are some pills, but it goes into the diet, it goes into these 2 one-hour sessions of chest physiotherapy a week, so you can see how that might be tough for a child or even an adolescent to want to do all the time. Next, I really want to talk about something I'm passionate about, which is the impact cystic fibrosis might have on a family. As I talked about in the 1960s, when you might expect a child with cystic fibrosis to not live to their early adolescence even, as a parent, you're going to approach that very differently. I remember with my cousin, when she was about 14, she was starting to act out in ways that most parents wouldn't want a 14-year-old act out on. I remember having a particular conversation in my car with her. She was really tearful, telling me about she just didn't see herself living very long and wanted to fit in everything she could in her life in that time, and that while her parents obviously didn't want her doing some of the things that she wanted to do, she just felt like she wasn't going to have the opportunity like everyone else had to. So at 14, you're thinking about being able to drive, things such as going out to the bars or hanging out with friends late, and those are things she just didn't think she was going to be able to do. So there's this tension in families at times between what appears to be behavioral problems, but what at times is just the individual wanting to live their life. It's this hard tension. So things to talk about in families are, how do we relate to this disorder? How do we work with it? How do we work with an individual that really wants to live their life to the fullest, and at the same time realizing that at 14 they might not be mature enough to handle some of the responsibilities that come with being adult. It's a very difficult balance, and one that families with cystic fibrosis are constantly trying to find. And you could see how from the outside it looks like, oh, this child is acting out, they're having behavioral issues, they don't want to go to school, but really they have this internal struggle with, how am I going to manage and approach life? So that's something to think about from the outside too. One other aspect that I wanted to talk about with cystic fibrosis that is of particular importance to me in regards to the family also is the amount of resiliency that it can bring to a family too, and the amount of closeness. As I talked about earlier with the treatment regimens, you see how invasive and rigorous the treatments are, and they at times they bring the family closer. They at times can pull it apart because we want to go and play outside, and then all of a sudden Jenna has to go in for a few hours of working on with her chest and getting the mucus up. But it also brought us a lot closer in a lot of ways too. We all banded together to help her out and support her. When we all wanted to play outside, we wanted to be there for her too when she had to stay inside and she couldn't move for a long time, and we learned how to play Uno very well at those times. So that was of particular importance to me. Any health disorder or mental health disorder can impact a family in a whole lot of ways, and cystic fibrosis is no different than that. It can impact it in, wow, this is really stressful in our life. We don't want to have to think about treating this every day, but at the same time, in my experience, it brought us a lot closer at the same time too. My cousin Jenna passed away in November of 2006 at the age of 16, and this presentation is certainly dedicated and inspired by her, and she had really meant a lot to our family, and we all knew it at the time how much she meant, and after she passed, she still meant a lot too. She certainly shaped our family in a lot of ways, and she's something I'm very thankful for. For more information about cystic fibrosis, you can find services around the neighborhood or in your particular area at www.cff.org. CFF stands for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and it's a great resource to find not only research on the subject, current treatment methods, or just places that you can go for support in your area. You can also contact Hoffman Estates Department of Health and Human Services. The contact number for that is 847-781-4850, and you could specifically ask for Brian Mizuki, and you could get contacted to my extension too.